Hi, I'm Trevor Williams with Global Atlanta, and we are here with Allen Fromherz, a professor of Middle East History and the director of the Middle East Studies Center at Georgia State University for our latest episode of Authors Amplified. Professor Fromherz, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about your book, The Center of the World, which I would say is somewhat provocatively titled because I think a lot of people would lay claim to that moniker or designation around the world, particularly when you look at places like China. So tell us a little bit about, and we're talking here about what we in the U.S. call the Persian Gulf, but has historically had lots of different names. But tell us about how you arrived at not only this title, but this subject of study of the Persian Gulf and its thousands of years of history.
Excellent question. Well, I think to defend the title, if you just look at a map of Eurasia, which is where the majority of the human population has lived over human history, you see that the Persian Gulf is really this hypotenuse. It's really at the center of Eurasia, and it is that connecting point between East and West, and even the South, even through Africa, because there's a major African influence in Gulf culture and history as well. And it's that unification of all of these spaces with the Indian Ocean world, which really was the world, so much more than the Atlantic, which was cut off because of the lack of ability to go across the Atlantic, except for the Vikings perhaps, until 1500. So we have the center of world history, this crossroads really being through the Persian Gulf as the easiest route from the Eastern Mediterranean through the Middle East, and then also all the way to China, because this is part of the story of my book, that there were constant and fascinating connections through the Indian Ocean and through the Silk Road to China as well. So yes, maybe the historians of China might say we're the center of the world, or the historians of France might say that we're the center of the world, but if you look at geography, I think we can make a pretty good case for the Persian Gulf.
Yes. Well, you also talk about the names in the book of the Gulf over history, and you mentioned, I thought was fascinating, that the word in Arabic, I think it's Khalij.
Yes, Khalij. Yes.
Has more of a connotation of connection than separation, which I thought was very interesting.
Yes, and that's definitely a theme of this book, is the connectivity that was brought about by this water, by this space, and how it was a bridge as much more than it was a gulf. In fact, even before the Gulf was formed, it was a river, and it's maintained some of that riparian river type character even to this day.
And you talk about some of the other names that it's been called over the millennia of conquest and changing of hands of different empires and such. Of course, we understand the reason we call it the Persian Gulf today, because you talk about Persia being kind of the first great global empire. But talk about some of the other names it's been called. And
under the Sumerians, it was called the Bitter Sea, which is interesting because of the high salt content. You can still float easily on the Gulf. It was called the Gulf of Qatif, and today on the Arabian shore, people like to call it the Arabian Gulf. So there is that contestation of the name of the Gulf, which is continuing to this day. But what I would really argue is that it's a global Gulf, because you have even more than just Arabs and Persians traversing through this space, that over the long-term history of the Gulf, you have people from Africa, people all the way from Indonesia, as I mentioned, even connecting to China, from India. You have the world really coming through this space as the crossroads connecting Eurasia. So that's the global aspect of this space.
Right. You talk about the attention that America has paid to this region, having really recent roots. I mean, it's and most of how we understand the region has to do with our own interests in a lot of cases, at least relatively in the last century or so, particularly with the discovery of oil. But obviously, we're talking here at the 5th District Studios here in Constellations in downtown Atlanta. in here in October, when we're about to see the first anniversary of the attacks on Israel from Hamas, and of course the ensuing war has kind of engulfed the region. Iran just shot some missiles, quite a barrage of missiles at Israel. So I guess being a professor of history or a historian, talk about why this book is relevant right at this moment.
Well, the hidden rift. Oftentimes, if you look at warfare, if you look at where the battle's taking place, you might assume, well, there must be the hidden reason for that battle in that place where it's happening. In fact, though, as a historian, if you look into the past, oftentimes the root cause is someplace outside of where the battle is going on. And if you look at the deepest rift that exists in the Middle East today, most foundational reason for this conflict is a rift that goes down through the Gulf, right? What was happening before October 7th of last year, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, even said this, we've never seen the Middle East so peaceful as it is now. That was before October the 7th, right? Over the past 20, 30 years, what was happening was a realignment where Israel and many Arab states, Israel had just signed the Abraham Accords with Bahrain, with the UAE. There was even some talk of Saudi Arabia beginning a process of normalization. There was an agreement even with Qatar, which was on the other side of things with the Qatar crisis. And it was looking as if things were becoming stabilized in a way that was against the interests of Iran, right? Because what Iran didn't want was to feel surrounded, or for there to be basically a NATO of the Middle East develop, with, of course, the backing of the United States, because the US in the end is the one that has the most interest in that type of alliance forming. So Iran, whether they had a direct command to Hamas, whether it was a direct communication or not, I know that's denied by Iran, but this conflagration that was caused on October the 7th is definitely something that has broken up that potential for a new Middle East that is stabilized around this new security arrangement that would have isolated Iran.
Yeah.
So that's
wow.
That's one major reason, I think, why October 7th happened when it did.
Well, and I mean, going back to the book itself, you talked a lot about this, really the Gulf that we kind of in the West sometimes see as a place of conflict, as a place of clashing empires and whatnot. Of course, it was that historically, but also a place of what you describe as strategic tolerance, which I thought was an interesting term. And I wondered if you could describe that and how both the geography and the economy of the region basically held up that ideal throughout history.
Yes, it's fascinating because the conflict, even though I said that the roots of it right now are in the Gulf, somehow they're not happening in the Gulf. And why is that? Well, both Iran and the Arab Gulf states have an interest in keeping that oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. And in the past, there was other commerce happening that needed to flow through the Strait of Hormuz as well. So there was an interest in at least keeping the commerce going, even if there were important issues or conflicts between people on either side. But for the most part, in fact, there's been a long history of mixing, not only between Persians and Arabs, but also with Africans, Indians, Asians from all around the world within this space. And there has been an interest among port city rulers, and these were mainly sort of like the Italian city-states, right? These princes who ruled just the ports and who had all of their revenue coming from the ports. They wanted to maintain as much commerce as possible, and it was almost a competition between each other. Who's going to be the top port? Who's going to get the most customs house revenue? Because they couldn't rely on agricultural taxes, which was the typical way that any other typical state or nation or empire maintained itself. they relied on these customs duties, right? And they didn't even have access to a hinterland with rich agricultural resources. So they were all in all dependent on a global system of exchange thousands of years before that economic system has come to dominate our world.
And you talk about the idea that this space was never really conquerable by any one power. Is that because that power was distributed among these kind of princely rulers of the ports of call, or was it deeper than that? And I think I read a little bit in your book about the actual the salt marshes, etc., that were kind of havens for rebel forces, if you will, at various times that made it very difficult. And the geography and the terrain has made it very difficult to conquer, I guess.
Yeah, the geography of the Gulf almost created this a natural fortress around the Gulf, right? So on one side, on what is the Persian side or the Iranian side, you have these incredible mountains, right? And very dry, and it's very difficult to get fresh water there. And fjords that are sometimes more challenging than what you'll find in Norway, right? On the side where we have Basra and what is now Kuwait and Iraq, we have these amazing and incredible marshes, some of the most complex marshes in the whole world because of the combined Tigris-Euphrates river system. And you have unpredictable flooding that occurs. It's not like the Nile, which is predictable. So the Nile, with its predictability, allows for an empire to go all the way up the delta. In Babylon or in Mesopotamia, you can't necessarily exert that same control all the way up to the shore. And you've had marsh peoples in these marshlands constantly rebelling, constantly proclaiming their autonomy and not being taxed. But also providing ways around the imperial authorities, and even outposts of empire, as Basra was, for example, the city of Basra itself often broke away from Baghdad or from the center of power. So then you have the deserts along the Arabian shore, which are even more difficult to penetrate, and which provide a buffer to inland empire as well. So the empires that developed around this region, they needed to use the Gulf, but they couldn't completely control the Gulf. So that allowed for these princely states, these states built on commerce and trade to develop in an autonomous way.
Do you see parallels, and we'll go back a little bit to the way the book is structured, et cetera, but do you see parallels, because we're on this subject, between that history and what we see now today in places like the UAE, which are, very much centered on global commerce?
Definitely, and it's
maybe a different mode, air travel versus sea travel, potentially.
Right. Yeah, and people think, oh, this is just a mirage, this came out of nothing, but there's other parts of the world that have enormous oil wealth but aren't successful to the same extent and haven't invested it in this way. And what it is that these Gulf states have a long and storied history of global commerce and knowing how that works, right? The princes would spend years away sometimes in Zanzibar or in India. They would leave behind their wives sometimes to rule, or even servants to rule in their place while they were gone. And this sort of commercial, this freedom of movement, this tapping into the monsoon especially, allowed for this Gulf, this Persian Gulf, to be a globalized space long before we had airplanes, long before we had steamships, because of the relatively rapid movement that could happen, especially with the predictable monsoons.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit, because
across the Indian Ocean.
The monsoon is almost a character in the book.
Yes.
Where do we get the word monsoon? We think of it as coming from India, right? But where do we get that word? And you talked about the unpredictability of the kind of flooding in the Fertile Crescent, I guess. But monsoon being predictable is kind of what drove this global commerce in a way, right?
Oh, definitely. Yes. And the Greeks claim that they discovered the monsoon, but that's just one of the earliest mentions that we have in documents about this weather pattern. And it's been known for 5,000, even longer, many millennia, as this constant, predictable wind and weather pattern that allowed ships to go from East Africa to India, and then eventually even to China if they did a 2-year voyage. And this allowed this vast space, which was the Indian Ocean, to play host to these global movements of people across this predictable pattern of time. And you would have places like Hormuz, one of the ports that I discussed in the book, where at certain times of the year it was almost emptied out, and then all of a sudden all the merchants would come, and it was as if the whole world was there. And even when they died, for example, they ended up burying each other, burying themselves next to each other, so you didn't have separate grave plots for Christians and Muslims and Jews and everybody else. It was just kind of this sense of a global community there that exists oftentimes on the ship and in the port in ways that it doesn't exist necessarily under one imperial controlled environment.
Yeah. Talk about how you structured the book. I mean, you talk about the geographic aspects in the introduction, but then you go on to describe these 6 ports: Dilmun, Basra, Siraf, Hormuz, Muscat, still the current capital of Oman, and then Dubai, which is kind of, I think, your kind of prototype of the global, the modern day global Gulf. But why did you see it as beneficial to focus on those ports particularly?
Well, I wanted to look at a place that sort of embodied what was going on during the time that chapter covers, or the one place that was perhaps most prominent during that span of time. So I don't only focus on those ports in that chapter. Of course, I move from one port to another, but the particular port that I choose to frame the chapter, I do focus some time on to show that how that port developed into the preeminent spot that it was in, and to give sort of a tale about the fact that the way that the Gulf functions, it's not that any one particular place just is naturally the place where the best port is going to be. That there's a certain flexibility in where this port could be located according to the economic situation globally, really, that the Gulf was interacting with at the time. So it made sense for Basra when there was a stable central government in Baghdad under the Abbasids. But then it made sense for Hormuz when the Portuguese were really the ones trying to be the overlords of what was happening in terms of commerce and between the Indian Ocean and Eurasia. So these places can shift easily, but there usually is one place that can kind of take the mantle as the Dubai of that time.
Yeah. And is that rooted in a certain, I mean, we talked about the tolerance aspect, but is it also rooted in a certain pragmatism or a particular personality of the ruler at the time?
Definitely, yes. I talk about it, that there's to each his own table, to each his own custom. And there was, for example, in Siraf, which is this incredible medieval port, it's a ghost town today. There's nothing really left, right? But it used to have skyscrapers that went up, 5-6 stories. They were made with abandoned ships, actually, that landed there. But there was a policy of allowing Hindu merchants who came to Siraf with their goods to eat separately, so as to avoid a situation where they are witnessing other people eating beef or eating food that is not allowed in their religion. And it's this kind of a deliberate accommodation, right? That each different merchant group can find a place where they can come and feel comfortable enough to trade that allowed these ports to be successful. And oftentimes the rulers of the ports would hand over even the administration of their customs house, where most of their revenue came from, to people who weren't even from their religious group or their family. And the reason for that is that they knew if it was a member of their family, they might just take over.
Right.
So
yeah, and you talk about even when the British Navy came through, right? That there was some sense of maybe not camaraderie per se, but like tolerance of even that, because each side recognized in the other a kindred spirit in terms of trade. And
yes, what's interesting about the British is,
and that outside influence is not necessarily tied to a rival faction, or at least not perceived to be such.
yes, well, and the rise of the British Empire, which the United States has kind of inherited, the British Protectorate is what it was called. The main motivation behind the British Protectorate was to locate particular rulers who could be held responsible for piracy or any raid against British ships. There was a major problem. It was getting in the news, especially when British women were being kidnapped, and this was particularly problematic for the British. So they wanted to say, well, if you have piracy in your realm, then you're responsible for that. But what that did was actually elevate those particular sheikhs and those particular rulers, the descendants of whom are still, and oftentimes still, ruling within the Arabian side of the Gulf to this day. So that was an interesting interaction, but the British never really went on land except in very rare instances. They even signed their treaties with the Arab Gulf sheikhs on the ship because they didn't want to go on land. And they didn't want to be held responsible for what was going on land. Sometimes the Ottomans would come and try to sort of claim some sort of vassalage or some sort of status connected to the Ottoman Empire, but then they also failed to take complete control on the land side of these Gulf states. So yes, it's a fascinating story.
Yeah. Well, I want to go very early and then jump very quickly to the modern day. So I was very interested to see to read the part about Dilmun's this
Dilmun,
sort of Dilmun. Yeah, sorry, I combined Hormuz.
It's okay.
I just created a new civilization. No, Dilmun, and you talk about it, being on the island that is now Bahrain, and there being natural springs of water that are coming up there. But really, to me, what was fascinating about that chapter was really how interlinked with the religious heritage of the region, which is now kind of blossomed into all the three monotheistic faiths today. Can you talk about that a little bit, about Dilmun, and how it kind of had an impact on the sort of origins of these three faiths?
Oh, definitely. What's interesting is Dilmun was the place of the immortal waters, underground waters. Gilgamesh was said to have gone there in search of immortal life, right? And it's connected to the flood story as well, which makes its way into the Bible. I frame that chapter around two main characters. In fact, one of them is named Ea Nasser. He's a very commercially minded merchant, right? And he goes in through the Gulf and out into the Indian Ocean world and connects with the Indus Valley civilization. That's where this really interesting, vibrant trade was happening between Sumeria and then Babylon and the Indus Valley civilization, which were two of the earliest civilizations in world history and the first real kind of global world system that ever developed. And the other side of it was Abraham, right, who came from Ur, which was also a port city on the Gulf, and he went the other direction, right? And in many ways went in another direction very symbolically as well, in becoming a monotheistic faith and going into what is now Israel-Palestine and establishing a particular vision of religion there, as opposed to Ea Nasser going out into the world looking for commercial opportunity. We actually have his account books still, right, in cuneiform.
Wow.
Yeah, from 4,000 years ago. And you can see that he was in trouble with his debts and he wasn't paying people properly. So be careful, you can still be responsible.
4,000 years later.
Thousands of years later.
You've read history.
Yes, by historian.
Yeah, even if it's ink you know.
Yeah.
Well, also, in kind of moving, thousands of years in this direction, the emergence of Islam, obviously, on the Arabian Peninsula on the other side, not on the Gulf side, but then spread throughout the region. What effect did that have on the sort of reputation for tolerance and commerce on the Gulf region? Of course, in the early days of Islam, it was very much a tolerant society in terms of Jews, Christians, Muslims living together in certain ports of Gulf.
Well, what's interesting about the very early history of Islam is that it started out very much as an Arab-focused faith, right? And even within the Quran, you read passages that this is an Arab Quran and you need to memorize it in Arabic. And still to this day, there's a phenomenon of people who know the Quran but don't know what it means because they memorize the Arabic but don't speak Arabic, right? So the Arab character of Islam was the first few decades of Islam, right? After the death of the Prophet in 632. But what happened is the establishment of outposts like Basra, just shortly after, just a few years after the death of the Prophet. And these became places where, after the Muslim conquest, people were brought from other parts of the world in many different cultures and many different backgrounds into one place. But they were all converting to Islam. So what happened in Basra is it became sort of this milieu, or this sort of the melting pot like we have today in the United States, of people becoming Muslim but bringing with them their own cultural background and mixing that with what it meant to be Muslim. So you could say that Islam, even though it started in Mecca and in Medina with the Prophet Muhammad, it became a global religion successfully in Basra.
Yes. And do you trace that origin to, say, Indonesia having the largest kind of Muslim population of any country?
Well, yes, and you even had Indonesian traders coming in and going into Basra and being influenced, and also the rise of Sufism, which happened in Basra, and the Sufi traders through their merchant networks going all the way into Sindh and into India, and then from there to Sri Lanka and into Indonesia, and that linkage very much existing. Yes.
Wow, great.
Yeah.
Well, so fast forward another 1,400 years or so.
Yes.
We have the quote-unquote discovery of oil. I guess on a global scale, the pumping of oil to power the modern global economy.
Yeah.
But you talk about the fact that people knew that there was oil there thousands of years ago.
If only they had consulted a classics professor.
Yes.
Who had been reading Strabo, reading the ancient Greek, they would have known that asphaltus, right, was very much something that was described in the early chronicles. And yes, there was this oil sand that was used even by the Abbasids, even by the Sumerians, and it was very commonly known. Now, what is interesting about the oil coming out of the Gulf today is that it's very cheap to get out of the ground, unlike the Gulf unlike the oil and gas in the United States, which requires fracking. So most people say, oh, well, the United States is now the dominant producer of oil, but it's the dominant producer of very expensive oil and gas. Right? It's still cheaper to get it out of the Gulf. So if the Gulf were somehow cut off from the rest of the world, which happens when there's conflict, then that would immedially raise oil prices. It would immediately raise oil prices and have a direct impact on things like, presidential campaigns.
Yes, everyone likes to talk about oil with a very little amount of nuance. But can you talk about how the discovery of oil maybe changed the calculus in terms of being an open, trading kind of region, or is it just an extension of that?
Okay, so before oil, you actually had another major global commodity. It was a luxury good called pearls, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you had the world pearl market, which was determining things. You even had Cartier coming and visiting the Gulf because that's where the finest pearls were found and were exported. And there was a big pearl boom. I don't know if anybody's seen Downton Abbey, all those pearls that everybody's wearing. They had to come from the Gulf, and that was the finest place to find them. But the pearl fisheries are very interesting because they're based on kind of this idea of the commons. So the different pearl shipping, or the different pearling tribes and groups would go out into the sea, but they would share the oyster banks, right?
Mm.
And it wasn't considered, oh, this is mine and this is yours and this can only be mine. They didn't have the maritime boundaries that have been put in place only very recently. Nor did they have necessarily a lot of terrestrial boundaries either. There was much more freedom of movement across what are now these state boundaries, even between Iran and Arabia as well. There was much more exchange and freedom of movement happening.
We talk about this line, this kind of artificial dotted line, and that goes through the middle of the Gulf, which separates the two major powers in the region.
Yeah, that's a more recent kind of rift that has happened, especially since 1979 in the Iranian Revolution, which unfortunately kind of bifurcated the Gulf between the monarchies that are supported by the United States on one side, and then the Islamic Republic on the other, and also Shia Sunni to some extent as well.
Mm-hmm. So what do you hope that readers, whether they be scholars or students or just the businessman or woman going on a trip to Dubai or Saudi Arabia, what do you hope that they take away from the book?
Well, I hope that they see that there's a much deeper history here, that you can easily be blinded by the extraordinary newness of the place and all the amazing new modern architecture that's coming up, and just you feel like you're in an air-conditioned bubble. Maybe get out a little bit, look at some of the historical monuments that are there. Some of the archaeology is finding these incredible tombs and places, and there was even a monastery, a Christian monastery that was discovered in the United Arab Emirates. Maybe get out and go to one of the cultural festivals as well. Go to the camel races, where you'll find Emiratis, where you'll find Qataris, you'll find Saudis, and try and talk to people who have ancestors that have been there for many generations, and you'll find that it's actually not so unusual to have this global character, especially in the ports, especially in these places of global commerce. And just remember, if we all of a sudden, there's right now there's debates going on about immigration and how much is too much, and whether, and even the Democrats who are supposed to be pro immigration are saying we want to limit immigration. Imagine the situation if you had 90% of your population from somewhere else and non-citizens. That's the situation,
right,
in places like Doha and places like Qatar and United Arab Emirates. And although it's caused a little bit of tension in some cases, there's calls for more opportunities to be opened up to nationals, to people who are citizens of those places. It's much less than you might expect if you sort of transported that same situation over here or even to Europe. So I think that can kind of put things into an interesting perspective, and also to look beyond the surface in terms of our assumptions about how the structure of power works in these places too. Because although I did just call them monarchies, they in fact weren't monarchies for a long time. That's a relatively recent kind of appellation or title that's been given to some of these Gulf governments. In fact, they were very much tribal chiefs.
Confederations.
And confederations, and first among equals. And you had many different groups, many different lineage groups who had their sheikh and their tribal leader that was often seen at a level similar to that of the sheikh who happened to have signed the treaty with the British. So look beyond and realize that still to this day there's kind of a culture of consultation that happens behind the scenes.
Well, also you talk about there being lessons in just the historical approach or the way
Right.
the way of thinking, particularly balancing the idea of having a very strong local identity and an openness to other cultures, other people around the world. And I feel like this is in some ways, you mentioned immigration, this is in some ways lacking in our modern society. It's often seen as either you have a strong local identity or you're a globalist. You're a global citizen, which is floating out there in the ether, unrooted,
Yes.
in your cultural heritage. And I think it's, you illustrate here that this has always been kind of a false dichotomy.
Yes, the idea of tribalism versus cosmopolitanism, that you can only choose one or the other. Even Fukuyama and Appia, these two intellectual giants, have been tussling with one another over this question of whether it's identity that drives human history, or is it this understanding of a larger human, of a larger humanity that's the impetus behind cosmopolitanism. And I don't think it's an either or. And as you're saying, yes, this is what the Gulf really shows. You have particular cosmopolitanism, right? You have distinctive cosmopolitans. So people who have a very distinctive identity and past, they're able to sometimes even retreat, say, to an oasis or to a mountain somewhere, to affirm that identity, or have parts of their family in those places. But then also have different locations around the Indian Ocean that are highly cosmopolitanism, or on the Gulf that are highly cosmopolitanism, where they also interact. Mm-hmm. And where you're on a ship for months at a time with 70 different religious groups and having to negotiate that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a long experience over 5,000 years of this type of negotiation. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why the Gulf has been successful as the center of the world, because it allows for people to feel like they are in the world, but also to have their own distinctive identity and background.
Allen Fromherz, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Trevor.